Hi, awesome students. Today's video, I'm going to talk to you about the so-called story of the Shakespearean sonnets. Now, this is going to be a relatively long video, somewhere between 15 and 20 minutes. So obviously feel free to fast forward or pause or whatever the case may be. But as always, I have a PowerPoint for you. That way you can sort of see what I'm talking about here. So like I said, we're going to talk about the story of the Shakespearean sonnets. There are 154 sonnets, right, first of all. But before we talk about what I'm going to talk about, let's discuss what I'm not going to talk about. We're not going to talk about the structure of the sonnets. We're not going to talk about rhyme schemes. We're not going to talk about an iambic pentameter. We're not going to talk about any of those things. Instead, what we're going to do, we're going to focus just on the core portion of the story that you get when you read Sonnet 1 all the way through Sonnet 154. And it's pretty cool. We're going to talk about the structure of that story. We're also going to talk about the three main characters that populate this story. So first of all, kind of what is the story about? Well, it's a love story, kind of, I suppose. And the reason why I say kind of is because it's sort of a one-way street. It's unrequited, if you will. The speaker who is, the one telling the story, the poet, if you will, he has great affection, profound affection for the fair youth. He's got similar, well, he's got not similar affection, but he has, we'll say feels love for the so-called dark lady. But both of those characters don't feel as strongly towards him as he feels towards them. So the first portion of the story, like I said, it's about the fair lady, or excuse me, the fair youth. And that begins on Sonnet 1. It goes all the way through Sonnet 126. And as a remark, he's got strong feelings towards this individuals. And it's not just the physical, right? And honestly, it's really not necessarily emotional. I would say that the speaker or the poet here would argue that the love that he feels for the fair youth transcends that type of love. And it's almost approaches spiritual type of love, if you will. Now, there's admiration there. There's friendship that's going on there. There is a physical desire that's going on there. But again, it's more him feeling this way towards the youth than the youth feeling this way towards him. We see that very early on in the first 17 sonnets that Shakespeare has written for us. And the speaker makes it very clear that he thinks that this youth is just beautiful and wonderful and on a variety of different levels there. And he insists upon the youth that he should get married. He should get married and should have children. And the reason why is because he wants the youth's beauty, both inner and outer, to be preserved for generations to come. And that'll happen by having children, of course, because those children will inherit that beauty. Well, the youth is like, no, I'm not going to do that. So Sonnet 18 is the poet, or the speaker rather, where he is trying to preserve the youth's beauty. So he writes this marvelous poem, and you are familiar with that poem. It's the Shall I Compare Thee to a Summer's Day poem. And it's his attempt to preserve what the youth is not going to preserve through marriage and children. The speaker's, we'll say, desires for, or love, or strong feelings for the youth continue on. 19 to 26, he becomes more and more attached. But like I said, it's sort of a one-way street where the youth doesn't feel the same way for him. It's just that simple. So there's sort of an unrequited love that's taking place. And it sort of continues to go on like this. 27 through 58, it goes on to strongly that the youth kind of doesn't really respond in the level of positiveness the way that the speaker would want him to. In fact, he extends his relationship circle, if you will, to the point where he's having a relationship with the so-called dark lady. We'll talk more about her later on in sonnets 40 to 42. And then also he honors some relationships or friendships with some so-called rival poets in sonnets 79 to 87. And needless to say, this crushes the speaker, hurts him, cuts him to the bone, if you will, right? To the point that he stops writing. We know he stops writing. He admits to this in Sonnet 100. And then also he reveals to us that this relationship, and I'll sort of put it in quotes, has been going on for about 3 years now. And that's in Sonnet 104. And he speaks about 3 springs. Again, he's sort of insisting himself upon the youth, where he really loves the youth. And again, the youth really isn't treating him in the manner that he wants to be treated. Now, let's just take a pause here. We're only getting one perspective. For all we know, Maybe the youth, doesn't really have a relationship with him, and it's more of a figment of his imagination, sort of an Edgar Allan Poe thing. I don't think that's the case. I certainly think it's more of a case where there is a relationship here, and just one person feels more strongly than the other person does. But anyway, this issue sort of continues on here from 105 to 121, to the point that their friendship is sort of coming to a close here. Their relationship is sort of coming to a close. And interestingly, the speaker starts blaming himself. It's like, well, maybe if I treated him better, maybe if I loved him more, then maybe he would sort of return this affection. In 122, sort of near the end of this, the speaker is given a notebook from this youth, and the speaker discards this notebook. And the reason why he does this is what he sort of claims is that he doesn't or rather reflects that he doesn't need any sort of physical token to remind him of the beauty and the memory of this youth here. But what it also sort of reflects is the breaking of that relationship. And in essence, the story ends there. Now, what's interesting is when we take a look at the final sonnet of this story arc, 1 through 126, the structure is different. Now, I remarked that I wasn't going to talk about the structure, but I think this is important. As you know, with a typical sonnet, like Shakespearean sonnet, you have 3 quatrains, meaning 3 stanzas of 4 lines each. So there you get your 12, and then it ends with 1 couplet. We also know that the rhyme scheme is A, B, A, B, C, D, C, D, E, F, E, F, and then G, G at the end. But Sonnet 126 discards this structure. Instead, what it is, it consists of only 12 lines instead of 14. And rather than having 3 quatrains and 1 couplet, it has 6 couplets. A couplet, by the way, is 2 lines that are successive and that they rhyme with one another, and they rhyme with a true or perfect rhyme, usually. And so when we think about what a couplet is for Shakespeare, we know that a couplet really is used by Shakespeare many times to sort of end or close a thought out, or an idea out, I suppose. So in this case here, he's ending the story with a poem that's built by nothing but couplets, or a sonnet that's built by nothing but couplets. And this also calls calls to memory the structure of a ballad. So the ballad has an envoy at the end, and what that envoy is, it is a short stanza that sort of closes out the entire poem. And this is kind of what this stanza is doing, not stanza, but this sonnet is doing, sort of closing out the poem. Now, it also kind of summarizes or underscores major thematic concepts that were taking place, which is primarily this idea that love and beauty, they sort of recede, they sort of are destroyed by time, if you will. And then last but not least, he sort of expresses this idea that, well, instead of sort of putting this use on the high place, right, he's going to be more guarded, or less guarded rather, in terms of his criticisms towards him. I don't believe that, but this is at least what he's saying. So now we transition into the second part of the so-called story of the sonnets. And this is known by scholars as the Dark Lady, if you will, right? And it's from sonnet 127 to, of course, 154. So it's only 27 sonnets in length, really, really short. We can juxtapose how he feels towards the Dark Lady versus how he felt towards the fair youth. Remember, earlier on, I remarked about how it was more of a spiritual love that he felt, that it transcended the physical as well as really the emotional. Well, that's not the case here, how he feels about this lady. With this lady, it's more carnal, it's lustful, it's sexual, if you will. And so we'll be able to juxtapose one poem from the fair youth, and we can juxtapose another poem from the Dark Lady, and we'll see the difference. We'll do that at the end of this conversation here. Something that should be talked about is why she's called the Dark Lady. Where is that coming from? Well, when we look at the first sonnet, there's language that the speaker uses where he says that in old age, basically, back in the day, so to speak, black was counted as not fair. However, he's changed. He doesn't feel that way at all. And so he recognizes the beauty of this particular woman, although paradoxically, in many ways, he sort of shows that he's not really physically attracted to her. I know it sounds like I'm talking about both sides of my mouth, where he sort of has this love and lust for her, but he's not physically attractive. But that's a concept that he's trying to reconcile himself to. So then, but why is she called the Dark Lady? Well, she does have long dark hair. At times it's described as being almost black, and other times it's brunette. But scholars have also argued that it's because she's of Mediterranean descent, or maybe because of African descent. They're unsure. There's not enough evidence, we'll say, to sort of go one way or the other. And that's obviously, it's outside of what our discussion is today. So what we do know is that this lady is sort of a mistress for him. Not sort of, she is a mistress for him. Now, the very fact that he considers her a mistress, that sort of shows you where he's holding her in terms of esteem versus where he might hold the fair youth. But that's really not a fair concept to say. It's not about the esteem, it's the type of love that he's expressing. So it's really interesting that for the fair youth, he's expressing this sort of spiritual, this divine love, if you will. But for her, it's more about the physical. And it's almost both of these characters are fulfilling needs for him that the other cannot fulfill. But what was similar between the two of them, regardless, is that as the relationship goes on, as the story goes on, as the sonnets move on, he becomes more and more dependent upon her for affection. And just like with the fair youth, this lady is less interested in him rather. In fact, 133 through 135, she's taking on additional lovers. The fair youth is one of those lovers in 132 to 133. So you can do a nice little thing, look at 40 and then 42, and then compare it to 132 and 133 and see what's going on there. He is, because of these certain things, because of how he feels he's being treated not well or abused, if will, he's constantly conflicted in terms of how he feels about her, where he fluctuates between criticizing her, like really criticizing her to the point where it's uncomfortable, if you will, to like pining for her, really needing a relationship with her. And we look at sonnets 135 to the early 140s with this. 143 and 144, there's this love triangle that he talks about, more so in 143. And the three people who are a part of this love triangle is the speaker, the lady, the dark lady, as well as the so-called fair youth. And so that's what's discussed in 143. But in 144, interestingly, he's excluded from this triangle where he only discussed the lady and he only discussed the youth. And so that's reflective, of course, how he feels, of how he feels both of them, neither of them are really providing with him the affection that he needs, that he craves, that he, desperately is begging for them for. In 145, she sort of bends a little bit towards him, where he describes that she says that she hates not you. Now, notice she doesn't say, I love you, but she doesn't say she hates not you. And he says that when she says that, when she reveals that to him, it saves his life. Whether that's literal or physical, that's up to discussion. The poetic story continues on here, where again, he's reflecting on himself, and he sort of has this conflict that's going on here. He sort of is disappointed in a lot of ways, and this is a frequent thematic concept. He's disappointed in himself in a lot of ways, that he sort of falls into this cravings of the body, right? This lustful desire. And he talks about that in 149 about, him using reason versus being love struck. Those two different actions. I can either think here or I can think with this part here. 151, he lets this part take control, where the lust or the desire for her, and he pines for her even more. But it doesn't matter, because in 152, the relationship, of course, finally ends here. The final two poems of this entire story here sort of serve as I suppose, a bookend for both of the stories. There's allusions to Cupid and some mythology and things on that nature, but importantly, in Sonnet 154, he acknowledges that water, no matter what it does, it will never cool his love. So regardless of how he's treated, he'll always have this desire, this dependency, if you will, on love, however it might be defined. Now, speaking of love, the last thing I want to talk to you about is how there are two different types of love that Shakespeare clearly sort of wrestles with here. We have the so-called spiritual, and then we have that sexual or that lustful one. For the fair youth, he was experiencing with him, or for him rather, the spiritual love, this sort of love that transcends the physical, that transcend really the emotional, and became something more. It's not to say that he didn't desire the youth in those ways. It just was much more than that. Whereas with the dark lady, it was clearly a sexual, it was a physical, It was carnal or lustful love, if you will, that he was feeling for her. So again, it's sort of like they're fulfilling two different needs that he has. The best way that we can sort of see, so you can sort of see the difference between them, might be to compare two sonnets. So I'm looking at sonnet 18 and 151 are two good examples here. We already mentioned in passing sonnet 18, and you've probably already studied this in other classes here. The famous question is asked, shall I compare thee to a summer's day? The answer is, by the way, no, he shouldn't, because the lover here, or rather the fair youth, is superior to a summer's day. But listen to the romanticism here. Listen to the melodrama here. Listen to how this isn't about the physical. It's more about something more. It says, thou art more lovely and more temperate. So you're more beautiful, basically, right, than a summer's day. Why? Because during the summer, the winds can blow too hard, maybe knock off the buds and the flowers. Summer is too short. It says, the leaves hath all too short a date. Sometimes the eye of heaven, the sun, it shines too hot. Sometimes the gold complexion is dim, so maybe clouds go in front of it, or there's a rainy day. And we go on and on and on here. But if you look at verse 9 or line 9 here, it says, thy eternal summer shall not fade. And then finally he ends it with the couplet. It says, so long as men can breathe or eyes can see, so long lives this, and this gives life to thee. I mean, much more spiritual than saying that you give life to me. And so here we have love that's being expressed in a more pure, if you will, a more clean way. Conversely, let's take a look at 151. I'm going to read the whole thing for you, and I want to sort of walk gently here, because this would be described as kind of a bawdy poem. Bawdy meaning it's coarse. It's got like dirty jokes in there, I suppose, because it's dealing with lust. It's dealing with the body, the physical, as opposed to the heart. And I'll tell you broadly, metaphorically, what's going on here. Metaphorically speaking, the body is being compared to a phallus symbol. And we know what a phallus is, or a phallic, that is the male sexual organ. And I'll just sort of highlight some verbiage here, and you can sort of put two and two together for yourself. So if we jump down here, right, he's talking about my soul that taught my body that he may triumph in love, and flesh days no farther reason, but rising at thy name, that word rising. And then jump over here, right? He talks about to stand in thy affairs, fall by thy side, right? And then jump back, her love. So the way he feels for her makes her what? Makes him what? Rise and fall. And so we can sort of see the coarseness of this. So there's the story of the sonnets. So it's from sonnet 1 to 154. Sonnet 1 to 126 deals with the fair youth, and 127 is with, and 127 onwards primarily is talking about the so-called dark lady, how he feels about both of them. In both cases is sort of unrequited love, but there's two types of love that he's experiencing. One we sort of coined as being spiritual, and the other being more sexual or physical. If you have any questions, by all means, ladies and gentlemen, you are welcome to reach out to me, send me any sort of emails. My email address, of course, is james.foltz@redclay.k12.de.us, or feel free to comment below, and I'll help you out from there. Have a great day. Bye now.